Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the life of a man whose face you've probably seen 1,000 times. Maybe on a t-shirt, a poster, or a protest banner. Ernesto Che Guevara. We're going to journey back, not just to the revolutionary firebrand, but to the boy, the student, the traveler, to try and understand the complex tapestry that wove together the icon and perhaps the idealist. It's a story of passion, struggle, and choices that echoed around the world. You feel the soft glow of your screen, the quiet hum of the night around you. Perhaps the distant patter of rain beginning to fall, a gentle rhythm for our exploration. This isn't just a history lesson. It's an invitation to walk alongside a figure who remains one of the most debated of the 20th century. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive the ideological whiplash of trying to pin this guy down with a single label by the end of our journey. But that's part of the intrigue, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, as you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our global community. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air in Rosario, Argentina, feels cool against your skin, carrying the faint scent of damp earth as a gentle night breeze whispers through the streets. It's June 1928, and somewhere in this city, a new life begins. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna. You imagine the quiet anticipation in the household of Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna y Llosa. They are not your typical couple of the era. He, of Irish descent with a restless, entrepreneurial spirit, and she, from a distinguished family, intelligent and progressive. They possess a somewhat bohemian flair, a touch of aristocratic lineage mixed with a healthy disregard for societal stuffiness, a bit like having champagne socialists before it was cool. Perhaps. You can almost hear the creak of the floorboards in their home, the muted sounds of a city settling down for the night. As you picture this family on the cusp of welcoming the boy who would one day be known simply as Che, the early years for young Ernesto, or Ernestito, as he was affectionately called, are a tapestry woven with threads of privilege and unexpected hardship. You see him as a toddler, barely 2 years old, when the first chilling wheeze escapes his small lungs. It's the onset of asthma, a condition that will shadow him for the rest of his life, a constant, unwelcome companion. You feel the tightness in your own chest, just imagining the struggle for breath, the nights punctuated by coughing fits, the ever-present scent of remedies and atomizers. This illness forces the family to move, seeking climates more forgiving to his fragile lungs, first to Buenos Aires, then to Alta Gracia in the serene hills of Cordoba province. Picture the landscapes changing around you, from bustling cityscapes to the calmer, drier air of the countryside, each move a hope for relief. Yet, this relentless battle with his own body seems to forge in him an iron will. You watch him, a boy who refuses to be defined by his ailment. He pushes his physical boundaries with a fierce determination. He throws himself into swimming, his gasps for air competing with the splash of water. He plays rugby, a sport not exactly known for its gentleness, his slight frame tackling opponents with surprising ferocity. Clearly, taking it easy wasn't in his vocabulary, even if wheezing uncontrollably sometimes was. It's as if each labored breath only fuels his desire to prove himself, to conquer limitations. This relentless drive, this refusal to succumb, becomes a defining characteristic. Beyond the sports field, another world unfolds for young Ernesto, a world found within the pages of books. His parents' library is extensive, a treasure trove for a curious mind often confined indoors by his asthma. You can almost smell the comforting scent of old paper and ink as you imagine him curled up, perhaps by lamplight as the evening draws in, devouring stories of adventure by Jules Verne, Emilio Salgari, and Alexandre Dumas. He loses himself in tales of pirates, explorers, and valiant heroes. But his literary diet is far from one-sided. He delves into poetry, feeling the rhythms of Baudelaire and Verlaine, the passionate verses of Pablo Neruda. By his teenage years, you see him grappling with philosophy and psychology, reading Freud, Adler, and later, the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre. He was probably the only kid requesting Sartre for his birthday alongside a new football. This vast, eclectic ocean of words shapes his intellect, broadens his horizons, and perhaps plants the initial, subtle seeds of critical thought about the world around him. The family atmosphere itself is intellectually stimulating. His parents are well-read, politically aware, and hold liberal, anti-Peronist views. Dinner table conversations might have touched upon current affairs, social injustices, or philosophical ideas. Considerable academic discussion revolves around how deeply his parents' somewhat rebellious and anti-establishment views truly imprinted on young Ernesto's burgeoning worldview versus his own later experiences. Was he absorbing a nascent sense of justice from these discussions? Or was it merely the backdrop to a childhood more focused on personal struggles and literary escapes? You find yourself pondering this as you imagine the boy listening, absorbing, perhaps not yet forming concrete ideologies, but developing a questioning mind. It's a mainstream historical fact that Ernesto Che Guevara was born on June 14, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina. Though you might find some sources whispering about a slightly earlier date in May, a quiet adjustment perhaps linked to the timing of his parents' marriage. These little human details often get smoothed over in the grand narratives of history, don't they? But it's in these nuances that we find the person behind the legend. His formal education is somewhat erratic due to his health and the family's moves, but his intellect shines through. He is sharp, inquisitive, with a particular aptitude for mathematics. Yet, it's the world beyond textbooks that seems to call to him most profoundly. You see him observing, always observing. Perhaps it's the disparity between his own family's comfortable, if sometimes unstable, circumstances and the lives of the poorer people he encounters in Alta Gracia. The town is a health resort, and he would have seen others suffering from different ailments, people from various walks of life. The Argentina of his youth is a complex place, a nation of immigrants, rich in resources, but also marked by social and economic divides. Peronism is on the rise, a powerful political movement that elicits strong reactions, both for and against. While his family is decidedly anti-Peronist, these political currents are part of the air he breathes. You try to imagine him, not as the future revolutionary, but as a young man on the cusp of adulthood, wrestling with his studies. He will later choose medicine, his health, his passions, and the subtle, perhaps then unarticulated questions about fairness and the structure of society that his reading and environment might have begun to stir within him. The night deepens around you, The rain, if it was falling, might have softened to a gentle drizzle, the kind that lulls you into contemplation. You think of young Ernesto, not yet Che, lying awake, perhaps listening to his own breathing, the ever-present reminder of his body's fragility, yet his mind already ranging across continents and ideas far beyond the confines of his room. The seeds of change, the experiences that will later ignite a fervent desire to reshape the world, are being sown, quietly, almost imperceptibly, in these formative years. The journey from this thoughtful, asthmatic boy to the revolutionary icon is still a long one, hidden in the mists of the future. But the first steps, the first conscious and unconscious leanings, are taking shape under the vast Argentine sky. You sense that restlessness, that intellectual energy cultivated in his youth, now yearning for a wider canvas than university lecture halls or even the rugby field. The world he'd read about in those countless books, from thrilling adventures to stark social critiques, is calling to him, not just to be imagined, but to be experienced firsthand. You imagine him in Buenos Aires, deep in his medical studies, the scent of formaldehyde and textbooks filling his days, yet his mind already wandering to distant horizons. The Argentina he knows feels too small, too familiar. A deeper understanding of the continent, of Latin America itself, begins to beckon a continent he felt was not a collection of separate nations, but a single, sprawling entity with shared pains and perhaps a shared destiny. And so, the idea of a journey takes root, a grand, somewhat audacious adventure. You see him, now in his early 20s, his lanky frame still carrying that air of quiet intensity, talking animatedly with his older friend, Alberto Granado. Alberto is a biochemist, a few years Ernesto's senior, robust and gregarious, possessing a similar spirit of adventure. They cook up a motorcycle trip across South America. Their steed, a sputtering, ancient 1939 Norton 500cc motorcycle they grandly christen La Poderosa II, the Mighty One. You can almost picture it, a machine held together by hope, determination, and probably a fair bit of wire. It was less the Mighty One, and more the occasionally cooperative one. But you have to admire their optimism. The official aim is to gain practical experience working in leprosy colonies along their route, a noble goal for two young men in the medical field. But beneath this, you sense a deeper, more personal quest for discovery, for understanding the raw, unvarnished realities of their continent. The Southern Hemisphere summer of early 1952. Imagine the final preparations, the scent of oil and gasoline mingling with the humid night air as they pack their meager belongings. Their planning was, shall we say, optimistically vague, relying more on charm and the kindness of strangers than a detailed itinerary. A bit like some student holidays, really. There's a nervous excitement, the kind that prickles your skin before any great leap into the unknown. You feel the rumble of La Poderosa beneath them as they finally set off, leaving the familiar streets of Argentina behind. The stars of a vast southern sky, their silent witnesses. The wind whips at your face, carrying the scent of open road and the promise of the unknown. This isn't some leisurely tour. The journey is arduous, a constant battle against mechanical failures, treacherous roads, and the elements. La Poderosa, true to its unreliable nature, breaks down frequently, leaving them stranded in remote, unforgiving landscapes. You picture them, hands grimy with grease, tinkering with the engine under a scorching sun or a sky threatening rain, their initial enthusiasm tempered by frustration, yet their resolve somehow hardening with each setback. Remember his asthma. You can imagine him, perhaps after a particularly dusty stretch of road or a night spent in the cold, high Andes, fighting for breath, yet pushing onward. That same tenacity you saw in the boy battling his illness is now channeled into conquering the continent. They travel south from Argentina, then up through Chile. You are with them as they navigate the breathtaking, desolate beauty of the Atacama Desert, the driest place on Earth. The nights here are incredibly clear, the stars so bright they seem almost within reach. You feel the biting cold as they cross the Andes, the air thin, the landscape rugged and immense. It's here, in places like the Chuquicamata copper mine in Chile, that Ernesto's eyes are truly opened to the brutal exploitation of workers. You see the miners, their faces etched with hardship, their bodies worn down by dangerous labor for meager pay, often for foreign-owned companies. A simmering anger begins to stir within you, mirroring what he must have felt, a profound sense of injustice. The journey continues into Peru. La Poderosa finally gives up the ghost, its mighty spirit extinguished, but they press on, undeterred, hitchhiking, walking, taking whatever transport they can find, precarious trucks, riverboats. You admire their sheer persistence. They are no longer just two friends on a lark. They are pilgrims on a path of stark revelation. You drift with them down the Amazon River on a crowded barge, the air thick with humidity, the sounds of the jungle a constant, vibrant backdrop. The poverty they witness is relentless. The disparity between the rich and the poor, a gaping wound across the face of the land. They encounter indigenous communities, the descendants of once great empires, now often marginalized and dispossessed. You sense Ernesto's growing empathy, his intellectual understanding of inequality now being seared into his soul by direct experience. Their time in the leprosy colonies, particularly at San Pablo on the banks of the Amazon in Peru, is profoundly moving. You see them interacting with the patients, not with fear or pity, but with warmth and respect, shaking hands with those whose ungloved touch was often shunned. Ernesto, the medical student, is in his element, caring for the sick. But he is also Ernesto, the humanist, seeing beyond the disease to the shared humanity. He famously refuses to wear gloves, a small act of defiance against stigma, a gesture that speaks volumes. You feel the quiet dignity of the people in these isolated communities, their resilience in the face of immense suffering. These encounters strip away any remaining romantic notions about poverty or illness, replacing them with a compassionate, unshakable conviction. The first major motorcycle journey undertaken by Ernesto Che Guevara and Alberto Granado began in January 1952 and covered thousands of miles across South America, profoundly influencing Guevara's political consciousness. This isn't just a footnote in his biography, it's a crucible. The diary he keeps during this time, later published as The Motorcycle Diaries, charts his internal transformation. You can almost read over his shoulder as he writes by the dim light of a candle or a sputtering lamp in some cheap lodging house, the words flowing with a new urgency, a new passion. He writes of the beauty of the landscapes, but increasingly, of the pain of its people. A pan-Latin American identity begins to form in his mind, a sense that the struggles of the Chilean miner, the Peruvian peasant, the Colombian city dweller are all interconnected. He observes the pervasive influence of foreign powers, particularly the United States, in the economies and political affairs of the nations they visit. He sees how this often perpetuates inequality and hinders genuine development, while Alberto was busy testing his charm on the local señoritas. You were probably already drafting a mental manifesto on equitable llama distribution, or at least, Ernesto was beginning to formulate the questions that would lead him down such paths. His sense of justice, once perhaps an abstract ideal nurtured by books and family discussions, is now forged in the fire of lived experience. The journey eventually takes them to Colombia and then Venezuela, where Alberto decides to stay for a job. Ernesto continues on alone for a short while before flying to Miami, then returning to Argentina to complete his medical degree. But he is not the same man who left. The roads of South America have imprinted themselves on his soul. You feel the weight of the experiences he carries back with him, the faces he cannot forget, the injustices he can no longer ignore. The transformation is palpable. The somewhat carefree student has been replaced by a man with a burning sense of purpose, though its exact form is yet to be determined. The extent to which this journey single-handedly radicalized Guevara is a point of ongoing scholarly deliberation, with some emphasizing its profound impact, while others point to later experiences in Guatemala as more decisive catalysts for his revolutionary path. But what seems undeniable is that these months on the road were transformative, chiseling away at his old perspectives and laying the foundation for the Che Guevara the world would come to know. He had seen, he had felt, and he had begun to understand the continent not as a tourist, but as a participant in its vast, unfolding drama. The night feels deeper now, as you contemplate this pivotal chapter. The distant sounds you hear might be the crickets in a remote Andean village, or the lapping of Amazonian waters against a riverbank, echoes of a journey that reshaped a man, and through him, a part of modern history. The open road had delivered its harsh, illuminating lessons. You feel the dust of those South American roads still clinging to you, the echoes of the myriad voices and the weight of the injustices witnessed on that transformative motorcycle journey. Ernesto is back in Buenos Aires, a freshly minted doctor, the ink barely dry on his medical degree from 1953. You might expect him to settle down, perhaps open a quiet practice, the memory of La Poderosa and Alberto Granado fading into fond anecdote. But the man who returned is not the same one who left. The seeds of conviction planted during his travels have taken root, and the comfortable life of an Argentine doctor feels less like an achievement and more like a gilded cage. That restlessness you sensed in his youth, the one that propelled him through books and across continents, now burns with a fiercer, more defined purpose. The late-night sounds of Buenos Aires, the tango music drifting from a distant cafe, the rumble of the trams, they all seem to whisper of a world beyond, a world calling for action. So, later that year, 1953, he sets off again. You travel with him, not on a sputtering motorcycle this time, but by bus, by train, a more solitary journey perhaps, but no less driven. He heads first to Bolivia, where a nationalist revolution had taken place in 1952, eager to see its progress and challenges. Then onwards, through Peru again, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica. In each place, you see him connecting with other Latin American exiles, with students, with left-leaning intellectuals. He's like a sponge, soaking up political theories, listening to first-hand accounts of struggles against dictatorships and foreign exploitation. He's still trying to figure out his role, his path. He was living on a shoestring budget that would make even a modern backpacker wince, a diet apparently consisting mainly of idealism and the occasional cheap empanada. Yet, his resolve only seems to strengthen. Finally, in December 1953, you arrive with him in Guatemala. The air here feels different, charged with a nervous energy, a sense of hope and precarious change. Guatemala City is bustling, vibrant, and at its heart is the government of President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Arbenz is a democratically elected leader, a former army officer attempting to steer his country towards genuine social and economic reform. You feel a spark of optimism, sharing in the cautious excitement that must have permeated the city for those who yearned for progress. The nights are filled with fervent discussions in smoky cafes, lamplight illuminating earnest faces as people debate the future. You listen in, sensing Ernesto's intellectual curiosity and his growing emotional investment in what he's witnessing. At the core of Arbenz's program is agrarian reform, particularly Decree 900. You see the vast, fertile lands of Guatemala, much of it lying fallow, held by a tiny elite and, most significantly, by the powerful, American-owned United Fruit Company, UFCO. UFCO was so influential, it was often called El Pulpo, the octopus, its tentacles reaching into every aspect of Guatemalan life and politics. They basically wrote the menu, and bananas were always the special of the day, whether you liked it or not. Arbenz's reforms aim to expropriate these large, uncultivated landholdings and redistribute them to landless peasants. It's a move that promises to uplift hundreds of thousands from poverty, to create a more equitable society. For Ernesto, who had seen the desperate plight of landless campesinos across the continent, this is a revelation. A government actually trying to implement the kind of changes he was beginning to believe were essential. He meets Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist and political exile, sharp-witted and sharing many of his burgeoning ideals. She introduces him to other activists and helps him navigate the complex political landscape. You see him trying to find work as a doctor, but also immersing himself in the political ferment, reading, observing, debating. He writes articles, analyses the situation, but largely remains on the periphery, an engaged observer rather than a central player. He's keenly aware of the forces arrayed against Arbenz, Washington, deeply enmeshed in the Cold War and highly protective of American corporate interests, views Arbenz's reforms with growing alarm, labeling them as communist-inspired. Key figures in the Eisenhower administration, like Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, have strong personal and professional ties to the United Fruit Company. The writing, you sense, is already on the wall, illuminated by the harsh glare of geopolitical interests. The tension becomes a palpable thing you can almost taste in the night air. Rumors begin to circulate like unquiet spirits through the streets of Guatemala City. Propaganda, funded and disseminated by the CIA, paints Arbenz as a Soviet puppet. Then, in June 1954, the carefully orchestrated coup, codenamed Operation PB Success, unfolds. In June 1954, the democratically elected government of President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala was overthrown in a coup d'etat, codenamed Operation PB Success, which was organized and funded by the UA, Central Intelligence Agency. You feel the shock, the disbelief, then the rising tide of fear. A relatively small force of mercenaries and Guatemalan exiles, led by Carlos Castillo Armas, invades from Honduras. But their real power lies in the psychological warfare. The radio broadcasts sowing confusion and panic, and, critically, the unmarked planes, piloted by CIA contractors, that begin to bomb strategic targets and terrorize the population. The distant thrum of those planes at night becomes a terrifying sound, a harbinger of doom. You witness Ernesto's reaction, a mixture of outrage and a desperate desire to act. He tries to join popular militias, to offer his medical skills, to contribute to the defense of the government he so admired. You can picture him, eager to join some glorious last stand, probably offering to set up a field hospital or at least vigorously debate the enemy into submission. But the resistance is disorganized. Arbenz himself seems hesitant to arm the populace, and the military leadership quickly crumbles or defects. The coup succeeds with brutal efficiency. Arbenz is forced to resign and flee. Hope is extinguished, replaced by a chilling crackdown. This is the harsh lesson for Ernesto. He sees a democratically elected government pursuing moderate reforms to benefit its people, crushed by an external power acting in concert with domestic elites. His idealism collides head-on with the brutal realities of power politics and imperialism. The belief that meaningful change could be achieved through peaceful, democratic means is shattered. If even this moderate attempt at reform could be so ruthlessly suppressed, what hope was there for the kind of deeper transformations he felt were necessary? He takes refuge in the Argentine embassy, along with other supporters of the Arbenz government. You feel his frustration, his anger, his disillusionment. The nights in the embassy must have been long, filled with hushed, bitter conversations and the stark realization of defeat. Eventually, he is granted safe passage to Mexico. He leaves Guatemala a changed man, more cynical perhaps, but also more resolute. The experience has solidified his anti-imperialism and has begun to convince him that armed struggle might be the only viable path for revolutionary change in Latin America. Debate continues among historians regarding the precise level of direct Soviet influence, if any, on Arbenz's policies, versus the coup being primarily a U.S. reaction to protect corporate interests and assert Cold War dominance in the hemisphere. For Ernesto, however, the takeaway was unambiguous. The United States would not tolerate any challenge to its hegemony, no matter how democratic or justified. Guatemala was not just a political event for him, it was a personal turning point, a searing confirmation of the theories he had been absorbing and the injustices he had witnessed. The gentle lamplight that once illuminated hopeful discussions in Guatemalan cafes now seems to cast long, dark shadows of doubt and determination in his mind as he journeys towards Mexico, carrying the bitter lessons of Arbenz's fall. The fire of his ideals had not been extinguished. It had been tempered, hardened, and was now seeking a new, more potent form of expression. You find yourself now in the sprawling, vibrant chaos of Mexico City, arriving with Ernesto in September 1954. The air here is different from the crushed hope of Guatemala. It's thicker, perhaps with the scent of street food tacos al pastor, elotes sizzling on sidewalk carts, and the distant, melancholic strumming of a mariachi guitar. But beneath the surface energy of this immense metropolis, there's an undercurrent of hushed urgency. Mexico City is a traditional haven for political exiles from across Latin America, a place where whispered conversations in dimly lit rooms can carry the seeds of future revolutions. You feel the lingering bitterness of Guatemala still clinging to Ernesto, a raw wound that fuels his determination. The quiet hum of your own room, the gentle whir of a fan, might echo the sounds of the city settling around him as he navigates this new, uncertain chapter. Life is not easy. He's a foreigner. His medical qualifications not easily transferable. You see him taking on odd jobs to survive, working as a street photographer for a time, then later finding a position in the allergy ward of the General Hospital, a role more suited to his training, where he also conducts medical research. His poverty is a constant companion. He lives in cramped apartments, often sharing with other émigrés. Hilda Gadia, his companion from Guatemala, joins him, and in 1955 they marry. Soon, their daughter, Hildita, is born, bringing a new dimension of responsibility, and perhaps a tender counterpoint to the harsh political realities that consume him. You imagine the soft lamplight in their small home, the scent of baby powder mingling with the ever-present aroma of books and cheap cigarettes. A fleeting domesticity in a life increasingly geared towards a larger, more dangerous purpose. It's within this milieu of displaced dreamers and fervent plotters that he encounters a group of Cuban exiles. They are young, intense, and burning with a singular ambition to overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, whose regime in Cuba is marked by corruption and brutality. You listen in on their passionate discussions, their plans, their frustrations. Ernesto, with his sharp intellect and the fresh, searing memory of Guatemala, finds a common cause, a shared enemy in American imperialism and its client dictators. He first connects with Raúl Castro, Fidel's younger brother, a man who shares his communist leanings and recognizes in Ernesto a kindred spirit. Then comes the fateful night, likely in early July of 1955. You are there, a silent observer in a small, unassuming Mexico City apartment. The air is probably thick with anticipation, the scent of strong coffee, and the haze of cigarette smoke. It's here that Ernesto Guevara meets Fidel Castro. Fidel is a magnetic presence, tall, charismatic, a lawyer by training, already a seasoned political activist who had led an ill-fated attack on the Moncada barracks in Cuba 2 years prior. He speaks with an unstoppable torrent of words, his eyes blazing with conviction, outlining his audacious plan to return to Cuba with an armed expedition and ignite a revolution. Ernesto listens intently. You recall his voracious reading, his intellectual grappling with Marxist theory, his first-hand experience of imperial power in Guatemala. It all seems to have led him to this moment, to this man. The conversation, as legend has it, lasts for hours, stretching deep into the night. They discuss the political situation in Cuba, the lessons from Guatemala, the theories of revolution, the writings of José Martí, Cuba's independence hero. There's an immediate, powerful connection. Fidel, the pragmatic and inspiring leader, finds in Ernesto a fiercely dedicated intellectual with practical medical skills and a profound theoretical understanding of revolutionary struggle. Ernesto, the wandering idealist who has seen peaceful change crushed, finds in Fidel a man of action, a leader capable of translating conviction into reality. By the time the first hint of dawn is painting the Mexico City sky, Ernesto has made his decision. He will join Fidel's 26th of July movement. He will be the group's doctor. The call he had been waiting for, the chance to move from observer to participant, had finally arrived. It's during this period that he earns the nickname that will become legendary. Argentines like himself frequently use the colloquial interjection, che, a versatile word, something like hey, pal, or mate. His new Cuban comrades, amused by his accent and this verbal tic, begin to call him El Che, the Che, to distinguish their Argentine companion. He embraces it. It was certainly catchier than the asthmatic Argentine doctor with strong opinions. So Che it was. The name sticks, a symbol of his commitment and his unique place among the Cuban revolutionaries. The months that follow are a period of intense, clandestine preparation. You see them, a small band of determined men, undertaking rudimentary military training on a ranch outside Mexico City. Their training ground was probably less state-of-the-art military facility and more somebody's dusty backyard where the chickens were the only regular observers. They practice marksmanship, guerrilla tactics, physical endurance. Che, despite his chronic asthma, which flares up painfully during strenuous exercise, distinguishes himself through his discipline, his endurance, and his intellectual rigor. He becomes a respected, sometimes feared, figure within the group, known for his strict adherence to revolutionary principles and his demanding nature. He pushes himself relentlessly, and he expects no less from others. He helps to instill a sense of order and ideological clarity, drawing on his readings of Mao and other guerrilla warfare theorists. Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara first met in Mexico City in July 1955, where Guevara quickly agreed to join Castro's planned revolutionary expedition to Cuba. This meeting wasn't just a casual encounter. It was a fusion of energies, a pivotal moment that would alter the course of their lives and the history of an entire region. Academic circles continue to explore the exact dynamics of that initial meeting, whether Fidel immediately saw Che's full revolutionary potential, or if Che's role grew more from circumstance and demonstrated ability once in Cuba. Did Fidel perceive in him the future comandante, the strategist, the revolutionary icon? Or was he initially just a valuable addition, a doctor with a passionate commitment whose stature would grow organically amidst the struggle? These are the nuances that keep historians gently debating, sifting through memoirs and testimonies. The group faces constant challenges, meager funds, the watchful eyes of the Mexican police sometimes bribed, sometimes genuinely cracking down, and the threat of Batista's spies. There are arrests, setbacks, moments when the entire enterprise seems on the verge of collapse. Yet, under Fidel's charismatic leadership and with the unwavering commitment of men like Che, the preparations continue. They manage to acquire a vessel for their journey, a dilapidated, leaky yacht named Grandma. You can almost smell the mildew and engine oil as you picture it. The Grandma was less a warship and more a slightly leaky, overcrowded bathtub, but revolutionary spirit apparently makes for a good sealant, or so they hoped. It was designed for 12 people at most. They planned to cram over 80 men aboard. As 1956 draws to a close, the moment of departure approaches. The night air in Tuxpan, the Mexican port from which they will set sail, is thick with a tense, almost electric anticipation. You feel the quiet determination, the fear, the hope that radiates from these men as they prepare to embark on their improbable, almost suicidal mission. For Che, this is the culmination of everything: his travels, his studies, his experiences in Guatemala, his profound belief in the necessity of revolutionary change. He is no longer just Ernesto, the restless doctor from Argentina. He is Che, a revolutionary, about to gamble his life on a desperate voyage under the vast, silent canopy of a tropical night sky, towards an unknown destiny in the Sierra Maestra mountains of Cuba. The salty air of the Gulf of Mexico, which felt so charged with anticipation as you left Tuxpan, now feels heavy, oppressive, You are crammed aboard the Grandma, that infamous yacht, lurching through the waves. It's late November, early December 1956. The vessel, designed for a leisurely dozen, groans under the weight of over 80 men, their weapons, and their dwindling supplies. Seasickness is rampant, the stench of vomit and diesel fumes thick in the air. You feel the constant, miserable dampness, the gnawing hunger. The journey, meant to be swift, is plagued by delays, by storms, by the sheer unsuitability of their craft. Che, you recall, is battling his chronic asthma, each labored breath a testament to his endurance even before the first shot is fired. You can almost hear the strained wheezing, a counterpoint to the creaking of the boat and the anxious murmurs of the men. Finally, on December 2nd, after 7 agonizing days at sea, they make landfall, but it's not the intended beach. Instead, they find themselves floundering in a dense mangrove swamp near a place called Playa Las Coloradas. Their arrival in Cuba was less liberating heroes storming the beaches and more lost tourists accidentally wading into a swamp and immediately getting shot at. Not the grand entrance they'd envisioned. Batista's forces, already alerted to their likely arrival, are quick to respond. Within hours, the rebels are spotted. The planned stealthy infiltration dissolves into a desperate scramble for survival. The next few days are a horrifying blur of chaos, fear, and death. At Alegria de Pio, just 3 days after landing, Batista's soldiers ambush the exhausted and disoriented rebels. It's a massacre. Men fall around you, their dreams of liberation cut short in a hail of bullets. You feel the sting of betrayal as local guides lead them into traps. The carefully nurtured revolutionary force is shattered, scattered into small hunted groups. Of the 82 who set sail on the Grandma with such high hopes, only a handful will survive these initial encounters. It feels like the revolution is over before it has even truly begun. A shipwreck of an army, as Che would later describe it. He himself is wounded in the neck during one skirmish, a burning pain that adds to his misery. It's in these desperate early moments, amidst the gunfire and confusion, that Che faces a stark choice, a symbolic turning point. He later wrote about finding himself between a dropped box of ammunition and a medical kit. There isn't time for both. He chooses the ammunition. You understand the weight of that decision. The doctor is now, unequivocally, the soldier. His medical skills will still be vital, but his primary commitment is to the fight itself. The survivors, numbering perhaps less than 20, are isolated, starving, and relentlessly pursued. You trudge with them, deeper and deeper into the rugged, unfamiliar terrain of the Sierra Maestra Mountains in Cuba's eastern Oriente province. The landscape is a formidable enemy in itself, steep, jungle-clad slopes, treacherous ravines, a relentless humidity that saps your strength, and nights that bring a biting cold. Insects are a constant torment. Your gourmet meals now consist of whatever crawls, flies, or grows that won't kill you too quickly. A delightful change from those Mexico City empanadas you might vaguely remember. The darkness of the jungle night offers little comfort, only new anxieties, the fear of discovery, the rustle of unseen creatures, the chilling calls of nocturnal birds. Slowly, miraculously, the scattered remnants of the Grandma expedition begin to find each other. Fidel Castro, with his unwavering self-belief, manages to regroup what's left of his force. You feel a flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, as these few, Desperate men re-establish contact. The Sierra Maestra becomes their refuge, their training ground, and their launching pad. Life here is a brutal education in guerrilla warfare. They learn to move like ghosts through the dense undergrowth, to live off the land, to trust their instincts. Crucially, they begin the slow, painstaking process of winning the trust and support of the local peasantry, the campesinos. These impoverished mountain dwellers, initially wary, gradually come to see the rebels not as bandits, but as potential liberators. Their knowledge of the terrain, their provision of food and shelter, their intelligence on army movements become indispensable. Che, with his serious demeanor and sometimes uncompromising standards, occasionally clashes with local customs, but he also learns, adapts, and strives to treat the peasants with fairness and respect, a principle he rigidly enforces among the troops. You witness Che's transformation into a formidable guerrilla leader. His asthma is a constant battle. You hear him fighting for breath after strenuous marches, yet he refuses to let it incapacitate him. He drives himself and his men with an iron will. His discipline is legendary, sometimes bordering on severe. Che's idea of a light reprimand probably involved a 3-hour lecture on dialectical materialism and a forced march. He wasn't exactly Mr. Popularity all the time, but he got results. He insists on ideological clarity, on study, on ethical conduct. He is brave in combat, cool under fire, and increasingly, he displays a keen strategic mind. The Granma expedition, carrying Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and 80 other rebels, landed in Cuba on December 2, 1956, but was quickly ambushed, with only a small fraction of the original force managing to escape into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. This catastrophic beginning makes their eventual success all the more remarkable. Small victories begin to turn the tide, psychologically at least. The attack on a small army barracks at La Plata in January 1957 is their first successful offensive action. It's a tiny pinprick against Batista's forces, but for the rebels and the local population, it's a sign that the fight is not over. Other engagements follow, like the important victory at El Uvero in May 1957, where Che plays a crucial role, sustaining another wound, but fighting on. You feel the surge of adrenaline during these hit-and-run attacks, the desperate hope as they seize much-needed weapons and supplies. In recognition of his pivotal contributions, his bravery, and his strategic acumen, Fidel Castro promotes Che Guevara to the rank of Comandante Major in July 1957. He is the first rebel to receive this honor after Fidel himself, a clear indication of his rising stature and the deep trust Fidel places in him. As Comandante, Che takes on even greater responsibilities, training new recruits, planning operations, and establishing a disciplined, ideologically committed fighting force. Slowly, the rebel army grows. More peasants from the Sierra join their ranks. Students, intellectuals, and workers disillusioned with Batista's corrupt and repressive regime make their way from the cities to the mountains. A liberated territory begins to take shape, an area where the rebels exert de facto control. They establish rudimentary workshops to repair weapons, schools to teach literacy, and even a hospital. And in February 1958, a hugely significant development, the launch of Radio Rebelda. Broadcasting from a hidden location in the Sierra, this rebel radio station, often with Che's direct input, breaks Batista's censorship, transmitting news of rebel victories, countering government propaganda, and inspiring resistance across the island. You imagine people huddled around crackling radios in darkened rooms across Cuba, listening with renewed hope to the voices from the mountains. A recurring question among military historians is how such a small, beleaguered group of survivors managed to not only evade a far superior army, but also to eventually turn the tide of the war. Was it Batista's army's incompetence and low morale, Castro's charismatic leadership and political skill, or the rebels' unique ability to forge a genuine alliance with the peasantry and galvanize popular support? The answer likely lies in a combination of all these factors. The nights in the Sierra Maestra are long. Around a carefully concealed campfire, embers glowing softly in the immense darkness, you feel the camaraderie, but also the constant strain, the gnawing hunger, the grief for fallen comrades. It's here, in the quiet moments between battles, that the ideological commitment is reinforced, that the dream of a new Cuba is kept alive. Che, often seen reading or writing by the faint light, is a central figure in this, his determination a quiet, steadying force in the heart of the Cuban wilderness. The forging of this rebel and this rebellion continues under the silent, watching stars. The grueling mountain campaigns, the constant dance with death in the Sierra Maestra, have culminated in an astonishing victory. You feel the momentum shift as Batista's army, demoralized and corrupt, begins to crumble. Che's column, having fought its way across the island, plays a decisive role in the final offensive. His strategic victory at the Battle of Santa Clara in late December 1958, effectively sealing Batista's fate. On New Year's Day, 1959, the dictator flees Cuba. The revolution has triumphed. You are with Che's hardened, weary troops as they advance, no longer hunted rebels, but conquering heroes, part of a wave of bearded revolutionaries converging on Havana. The entry into Havana in early January 1959 is a moment of pure, unadulterated euphoria. You are swept along in the tide of joyous humanity. The city, so recently gripped by fear and repression, erupts in celebration. People pour into the streets, waving Cuban flags, showering the bewildered, dusty barbudos, the bearded ones, with flowers, cheers, and tears. The air, thick with the scent of tropical blossoms, vehicle exhaust, and the collective sigh of relief, vibrates with an almost electric energy. You see the faces in the crowd, hope, disbelief, adoration. For these men, including Che, who had known only the harshness of the mountains, the squalor of hidden camps, and the constant threat of death. This overwhelming reception must feel like emerging into a different world. After months of jungle rations, the thought of a proper meal in Havana must have been almost as revolutionary as their political ideals. The night in Havana is no longer about silent, fearful listening. It's alive with music, fireworks, and the roar of a city reborn. In the dizzying days that follow, a new government begins to take shape, with Fidel Castro as its undeniable leader. Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who threw his lot in with the Cuban rebels, is now a national hero, an icon of the revolution, his image already beginning to acquire that mythic quality. He is 30 years old. You see him, not in his tattered olive greens of the Sierra, but still exuding that same intensity, that same unwavering focus, amidst the chaos of revolutionary reorganization. He is appointed to several key positions, a testament to Fidel's trust and Che's own capabilities. The challenges are immense to dismantle the old Batista state, to address crushing poverty and inequality, to guard against counter-revolution, and to forge a new Cuba. One of his most significant and ultimately most controversial early roles is his appointment as commander of the La Cabaña fortress. You find yourself standing within the ancient, imposing stone walls of this vast colonial-era citadel overlooking the entrance to Havana Harbor, the gentle lapping of waves against the seawall below. The distant festive sounds from the city provide a stark contrast to the grim purpose the fortress now serves. The night air here feels heavy, not with jungle humidity, but with the weight of judgment. You imagine his office probably wasn't filled with fluffy cushions and live laugh love posters, more like stacks of manifestos and a very stern "no counter-revolutionaries allowed" sign. Following the victory of the Cuban Revolution in January 1959, Che Guevara was appointed commander of the La Cabaña fortress in Havana and, in this capacity, oversaw revolutionary tribunals and the executions of numerous individuals deemed war criminals or counter-revolutionaries from the Batista era. This is where the triumph of the revolution casts its deepest shadow. Here, Che presides over the trials of men who had served Batista's regime, policemen, soldiers, politicians, informers, accused of torture, murder, and other crimes. The revolutionary government argues that these tribunals are necessary to deliver swift justice, to purge the remnants of the old tyranny, and crucially, to prevent the kind of uncontrolled mob violence and lynchings that had occurred in other post-revolutionary situations. They see it as a cleansing, a painful but essential step to secure the revolution. You observe these proceedings, perhaps from a shadowed corner, the flickering lamplight casting long, distorted shadows on the faces of the accused and their judges. The trials are rapid, the atmosphere charged. Due process, as understood in established legal systems, often seems secondary to the perceived demands of revolutionary justice. You grapple with this. You remember the stories of Batista's brutality, the repression, the torture chambers. You understand the thirst for retribution, the desire to ensure that such men can never again hold power. Yet, you also feel a disquiet, a chill that has little to do with the night breeze coming off the ocean. The image of Che, the idealist, the man who risked his life fighting for the oppressed, now becomes more complex, more troubling, as he signs off on death sentences. His supporters would argue that he was meticulous within the context, ensuring that only the truly guilty were punished, that he was acting out of a stern but necessary duty to protect the revolution from its enemies. They would point to the widespread popular support for these measures at the time, a population weary of violence and demanding accountability. Che himself was unyielding, believing that sentimentality had no place when dealing with those who had terrorized the Cuban people. His discipline, forged in the Sierra, was now being applied to the task of consolidating power, and he believed that the revolution's enemies needed to be dealt with decisively. Critics, however, then and now, decry these trials as summary justice, lacking in proper legal safeguards, with guilt often presumed. The precise number of executions carried out under Che's command at La Cabaña and the fairness of the tribunals remain subjects of intense historical contention and are central to the debate about his legacy. It's a period that profoundly complicates the narrative of Che as a romantic hero, forcing you to confront the uncomfortable realities of revolutionary power and the brutal choices often made in its name. This is where the flawed idealist aspect of our journey comes sharply into focus. His asthma, a constant companion in the mountains, is still with him, perhaps a quiet, physical reminder of his own vulnerability, even as he wields such absolute power over life and death. Beyond La Cabana, Che is also a driving force in shaping the revolution's early policies. He plays a key role in drafting and implementing the Agrarian Reform Law in May 1959, a measure that strikes at the heart of Cuba's deeply unequal land distribution system, expropriating large estates and redistributing land to peasant cooperatives. You recall his early conviction, born from his motorcycle journey and solidified in Guatemala, about the centrality of land reform to social justice. Now, he has the power to make it happen. He is also instrumental in the nationalization of key industries, challenging foreign ownership and seeking to assert Cuban economic sovereignty. During this period, you also see the early articulation of his concept of the new man, El Hombre Nuevo. Che envisions a new type of citizen, selfless, dedicated to the collective good, motivated by moral incentives and revolutionary consciousness rather than individual gain. Creating the new man who works purely for moral incentives sounds great on paper. Convincing everyone to give up their paychecks and embrace sugarcane harvesting with a song in their heart. Slightly trickier. He tries to embody this ideal himself, shunning privileges, working tirelessly, and emphasizing voluntary labor. It's a profoundly idealistic, almost utopian vision, born from his deep Marxist convictions and his belief in the transformative power of revolution. The initial euphoria of victory is slowly giving way to the immense, complex, and often grim tasks of governance. The night in Havana, once bright with celebration, now holds a more somber, reflective quality for you. You ponder the man, Che Guevara, who is both a liberator and an executioner, an idealist who embraces ruthless methods, a healer who now sanctions killing. The shadows of La Cabana lengthen, reaching far into the future, forever shaping how he will be remembered. The echoes from La Cabana, the weight of those early, harsh decisions, linger in the Havana night as you continue to follow Che's path. The revolution, having consolidated its initial power, now faces the enormous task of governance and international survival. You see Che moving beyond his role as military commander and overseer of revolutionary justice, taking on new, complex responsibilities. He is appointed head of the industrial department of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform (INRE), a pivotal role in reshaping Cuba's economy. Then, in a move that surprises many, he becomes president of the National Bank of Cuba in late 1959. From guerrilla fighter to bank president, that's quite the career change. You wonder if he replaced the usual pinstripes with olive green fatigues for board meetings, maybe signing checks with Patria o Muerte in the memo line. It's a testament to Fidel's faith in his intellect and integrity, even if Che himself privately expressed doubts about his suitability for high finance. Famously quipping, he thought Fidel had asked if he was a good economista economist when he was actually a good comunista communist. As Cuba's relationship with the United States rapidly deteriorates, leading to an economic embargo and increasing hostility, the island nation seeks new allies and trading partners. Che Guevara emerges as one of revolutionary Cuba's most prominent international envoys, its voice on the world stage. You find yourself accompanying him on long journeys. The drone of airplane engines a new backdrop to your shared experience, replacing the chirping insects of the Sierra or the bustling sounds of Havana. He travels extensively, a tireless ambassador for a besieged revolution. In 1959 and the early 1960s, he undertakes missions to a diverse array of nations: Egypt, India, Indonesia, Japan, Pakistan, Yugoslavia, and across the Soviet bloc. You observe him in meetings with world leaders, men like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Indonesia's Sukarno, charismatic figures of the post-colonial, non-aligned movement, in these grand halls of power, surrounded by seasoned diplomats. Che, often still in his simple, olive-green fatigues, is an unconventional, striking figure. He wasn't one for the traditional diplomat's uniform of a stiff suit and even stiffer smile. Che pretty much made battle dress chic a thing on the international stage. His message is consistent, a denunciation of imperialism, particularly from the United States, a call for solidarity among the developing nations of the Third World, and an unwavering defense of Cuba's right to forge its own path. He seeks not just political support, but also trade agreements and economic assistance to help Cuba withstand the American blockade. The nights in these foreign capitals, Cairo, with the scent of the Nile and distant calls to prayer, the cold, imposing grandeur of Moscow, the vibrant, humid evenings in Jakarta, offer a kaleidoscope of experiences. You imagine him in quiet hotel rooms, the city lights twinkling outside, poring over documents, preparing speeches, perhaps battling his asthma in unfamiliar climates, always driven by that relentless revolutionary zeal. One of his most memorable appearances on the global stage occurs in December 1964. You are there, in the vast, somewhat intimidating hall of the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. The atmosphere is thick with Cold War tension. Che, as the head of the Cuban delegation, strides to the podium. He is clad, as usual, in his military attire, a stark contrast to the sober suits of most other delegates. His presence alone is a statement. His speech is fiery, uncompromising, a direct challenge to the established powers. You listen, feeling the intensity of his words, translated simultaneously into numerous languages, echoing through the chamber. He condemns U.S. aggression in Vietnam, its interventionist policies in Latin America, and the racial discrimination within its own borders. He passionately defends Cuba's revolution, its achievements, and its right to armed self-defense. He speaks of the specter of McCarthyism haunting the American people, and famously declares that an impressive popular movement against racial discrimination in the U.S. was being brutally repressed. He reaffirms Cuba's commitment to supporting liberation movements worldwide. In December 1964, Che Guevara, as head of the Cuban delegation, delivered a famous and fiery speech at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, denouncing imperialism and defending armed struggle for liberation. His words are met with a mixture of applause from some quarters, stony silence from others, and outright hostility from his adversaries. During his time in New York, there's even a bazooka attack on the UN building by anti-Castro Cuban exiles while he is speaking, though the shell falls harmlessly into the East River. Che, informed of the incident, reportedly remarks with characteristic coolness that it gave the whole thing more flavor. This UN address is perhaps the apex of his role as Cuba's international voice, but it's not an isolated event. He consistently uses international forums to promote revolution and critique the global order. At a conference in Punta del Este, Uruguay, in 1961, he delivers a scathing critique of President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, dismissing it as an imperialist tool designed to prevent genuine social revolutions rather than foster development. You can imagine him at a fancy diplomatic dinner. Someone asks for the salt, and Che launches into a 10-minute critique of their country's neo-colonialist salt trade policies. Small talk wasn't really his forte. His bluntness, his refusal to engage in diplomatic platitudes, often ruffled feathers and made traditional diplomats uncomfortable. Yet, for many in the developing world and among leftist movements globally, his candor is refreshing, his courage inspiring. Through these experiences, Che further develops his theories on international revolution. He becomes increasingly convinced that Latin America is ripe for similar uprisings, that the Cuban example can and must be replicated. He begins to articulate the idea of creating 2, 3, many Vietnams to overstretch and ultimately defeat imperialist powers. His vision of the new man, initially conceived for Cuba, takes on a global dimension. He believes in the potential for a worldwide transformation of consciousness, a global citizenry dedicated to socialist ideals and international solidarity. Scholarly interpretations vary on the overall effectiveness of Che's diplomatic efforts. Did his passionate advocacy win Cuba crucial support and inspire liberation movements? Or did his uncompromising rhetoric and open calls for armed struggle sometimes alienate potential allies and harden opposition? It's a complex calculation. He certainly put Cuba on the map as a defiant revolutionary state and became a powerful symbol for anti-imperialist struggles across the globe. But his unwavering, often dogmatic approach may have also limited Cuba's diplomatic maneuverability in certain contexts. As you observe Che the statesman, the diplomat, the ideologue on the world stage, you also sense a growing restlessness within him. The corridors of power, the intricacies of international diplomacy, the bureaucratic demands of his governmental roles, these are a far cry from the clear-cut struggles of the Sierra Maestra. While he throws himself into these tasks with his customary dedication, you might feel that his true calling, the one that burns brightest within him, is still that of the active revolutionary, the guerrilla fighter. The applause in international forums, the respect or fear he commands, may not satisfy the deeper yearning for direct action that defined his entry into the Cuban Revolution. The night sky viewed from a ministerial limousine is very different from the one seen through a jungle canopy, and perhaps his spirit longs for the latter. While Che Guevara's voice resonated on the international stage, drawing both admiration and condemnation, a significant portion of his energy during these years was poured into the Herculean task of reshaping Cuba's battered and dependent economy. You transition with him from the grand podiums of global diplomacy to the often less glamorous, but equally intense, battlefields of economic planning and industrial development, the sovereignty he so fiercely defended in international forums, he believed, could only be truly secured if Cuba broke free from its economic shackles, particularly its historic reliance on sugar and the overwhelming influence of the United States. The night in Havana still hums, but now it's often punctuated by the clang of fledgling factories or the weary sighs of a populace grappling with the growing pains of a revolutionary economy. As Minister of Industries, a post he assumed in February 1961, and building on his earlier role as head of the Industrial Department of UNRWA and his somewhat bewildering stint as president of the National Bank, Che wielded immense influence over Cuba's economic direction. You picture him in his ministry office, often late into the night, the room Spartan, illuminated by a single desk lamp casting its glow over piles of reports, blueprints, and economic treatises. He dove into economic theory with the same intensity he'd once reserved for guerrilla tactics. You could say his spreadsheets were now his battlefields, though arguably with more casualties in the common sense column at times. He was driven by a vision of a rapidly industrialized Cuba, a nation self-sufficient and diversified, no longer the sugar plantation of America. His economic philosophy was rooted in his Marxist convictions and his unwavering belief in the power of centralized planning. He championed the idea of moral incentives over material ones, a direct extension of his new man ideal. He believed that revolutionary consciousness, a commitment to the collective good, should be the primary motivation for workers, not bonuses or higher wages. Voluntary labor was a cornerstone of this philosophy. You'd often see him, Comandante Che, out in the fields, cutting sugarcane or working on construction projects alongside ordinary Cubans, leading by example, his ever-present asthma, no deterrent. Convincing city folk that a weekend hacking at sugarcane under a blazing sun is a form of spiritual enlightenment requires a special kind of charisma, and perhaps a subtle reminder of who's in charge of sugar rations. The ambitions were vast. The plan was to swiftly create a range of new industries, from machine tools and agricultural equipment to household appliances and textiles, thereby reducing Cuba's reliance on imports. Factories were blueprinted, sometimes with equipment purchased from the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. New trading partners sought in the wake of the tightening U.S. embargo. You feel the initial surge of revolutionary enthusiasm behind these projects, the hope of building a truly independent socialist economy from the ground up. However, the path to industrialization was fraught with monumental challenges. Cuba lacked a deep pool of skilled technicians, engineers, and managers, as many from the educated middle and upper classes had fled the revolution. The U.S. embargo was a crippling blow, severing access to traditional markets, vital spare parts for existing American-made machinery, and new technologies. The existing infrastructure was almost entirely geared towards the sugar industry and trade with the U.S., making diversification incredibly difficult. Moreover, the sheer complexity of centrally planning an entire economy, redirecting resources, and establishing new industries from scratch often proved overwhelming. Che himself, despite his intense self-study, lacked formal economic training, and his more ideological approach sometimes clashed with pragmatic necessities. As Minister of Industries in Cuba from 1961, Che Guevara spearheaded an ambitious program of rapid industrialization and economic diversification, aiming to reduce the island's reliance on sugar and foster a socialist economy based on centralized planning and moral incentives. This period saw the great debate within Cuban economic circles. Che advocated for a highly centralized budgetary finance system, emphasizing moral incentives and a rapid push towards communism. Others argued for a more decentralized self-management approach for state enterprises, allowing for greater use of market mechanisms and material incentives to boost productivity. It was a high-stakes intellectual contest over the very soul of the Cuban economic model. The results of these ambitious experiments were decidedly mixed. Some new factories were indeed built, and there were pockets of success in certain areas. But many industrial projects were plagued by inefficiency, poor quality control, shortages of raw materials, and an inability to meet production targets. The dream was a Cuba making everything from tractors to toasters. The reality sometimes involved tractors that toasted and toasters that, well, mostly just gathered dust. Industrial innovation is a marathon, not a sprint, especially when you're starting from scratch with half the instruction manual missing. Shortages of consumer goods became increasingly common, leading to rationing and growing discontent among a population that had initially embraced the revolution with such fervor. Ironically, despite the push for diversification, sugar often remained Cuba's primary source of foreign currency, essential for funding the very industrialization efforts meant to reduce its dominance. You sense Che's growing frustration. His dedication was unquestionable. He worked tirelessly, demanded much of himself and others, and genuinely believed in the path he was forging. But the intractable realities of economic development, especially under such adverse international conditions and with such limited resources, began to take their toll. His idealistic vision of the new man, readily sacrificing for the collective, often bumped up against the more prosaic desires of ordinary people for a better standard of living, for tangible improvements in their daily lives. The nights in his office, you imagine, became longer, the challenges more daunting, the solutions more elusive. The distant sounds of Havana might carry not just the usual urban hum, but also the quiet anxieties of an economy struggling to find its footing, the creaks and groans of an industrial base being pushed beyond its limits. There is considerable disagreement among economic historians concerning the primary reasons for the shortcomings of Che's industrialization drive. Were they due to the inherent flaws in his theoretical model, emphasizing moral over material incentives? The immense and undeniable pressure of the U.S. embargo, a critical lack of technical expertise and managerial experience, or an unavoidable combination of these complex factors. Assessing his economic legacy is no simple task. He identified crucial structural problems in Cuba's pre-revolutionary economy and was driven by a genuine desire to achieve economic sovereignty and social justice. Yet, the methods employed and the outcomes achieved often fell far short of the ambitious goals. This period of intense, often frustrating, engagement with the complexities of economic management may have also contributed to Che's growing restlessness. His yearning for a return to a more direct, less bureaucratic form of revolutionary struggle. The intricate dance of production targets, resource allocation, and 5-year plans, while vital, perhaps felt increasingly removed from the revolutionary fire that truly animated his spirit. The quiet hum of a struggling factory at night is a very different sound from the crackle of a guerrilla campfire, and you sense his spirit might be straining towards a different horizon once more. The scent of sugarcane fields and the metallic tang of new factories in Cuba begin to fade into the background as you sense a profound shift in Che Guevara's focus. The frustrations of economic management, the bureaucratic grind, and perhaps a deeper, more intrinsic need for direct revolutionary action seem to pull him towards a new horizon. You recall his passionate calls for 2-3, many Vietnams, his conviction that the anti-imperialist struggle needed to be fought on multiple fronts across the globe. The relative stability of his life in Cuba, even with its immense challenges, perhaps felt like a gilded cage to a spirit forged in the crucible of guerrilla warfare. The quiet hum of Havana nights, once a sound of triumph, might now feel like a stifling blanket. In the spring of 1965, Che Guevara vanishes from public life in Cuba. The world buzzes with speculation. Where is Che? Has he fallen out of favor with Fidel? Is he ill? Then, Fidel Castro reads a poignant farewell letter from Che, a letter in which he renounces his Cuban citizenship, his government posts, and his rank of comandante, stating that other nations of the world call for my modest efforts. He speaks of his desire to fight imperialism wherever it exists. You feel the weight of that decision, the finality of his break with the life he helped build in Cuba, the pull of an uncertain, perilous future. His destination, chosen after careful consideration and clandestine planning, is Africa, specifically the Congo, formerly Belgian Congo, then known as Congo Leopoldville, and later Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. He believes Africa, with its newly independent nations and ongoing liberation struggles, is a critical front line. He aims to support the Simba Rebellion, a leftist uprising against the Western-backed central government. You find yourself part of this covert operation, traveling under a false name, perhaps Ramon Benitez, in a carefully constructed disguise. He apparently went in disguise, probably involving a questionable wig and a new name. You can imagine him practicing a non-Argentine accent in the mirror, much to the amusement of the local wildlife. In April 1965, you arrive with him and a small, select contingent of Afro-Cuban guerrilla veterans in the eastern Congo. The transition is jarring. The humid, oppressive heat of the Congolese jungle is a world away from anything you've experienced with him before. The nights here are an entirely different entity, a thick, velvet darkness filled with the cacophony of unfamiliar insects, the distant roar of unknown animals, the rustling of unseen things in the dense undergrowth. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and a pervasive sense of isolation. The Simba Rebellion is already underway, but it's a fractured, poorly organized movement. Che quickly discovers that the realities on the ground bear little resemblance to his revolutionary ideals or his experiences in Cuba's Sierra Maestra. The rebel fighters, while often brave, lack discipline, training, and ideological cohesion. Tribal loyalties frequently overshadow any broader revolutionary purpose. Their leadership, including figures like Laurent Kabila, who would decades later become president, Che finds deeply unimpressive, lacking in revolutionary seriousness and strategic vision. You share Che's mounting frustration as he attempts to instill discipline, to teach basic guerrilla tactics, to impart some ideological clarity. Trying to explain Marxist guerrilla tactics to fighters who believed invincibility potions worked better than camouflage must have been an uphill battle. No, comrades, the dialectic is stronger than the magic water. Probably didn't cut it. The rebels often rely more on dawa, magic rituals and potions they believe make them invincible, than on sound military strategy. The challenges are relentless. Language barriers are immense. Che and his Cuban comrades speak Spanish. The rebels' various local languages, and some Swahili or French. Cultural misunderstandings abound. Logistical support is a nightmare. Supplies of food, medicine, and ammunition are scarce and unreliable. Communication with the outside world, and even between different rebel factions, is sporadic at best. Che himself suffers greatly in the harsh environment. His asthma, as always, is a persistent torment, exacerbated by the humidity and physical exertion. He contracts dysentery, which leaves him weakened. You see the physical toll this ill-fated campaign takes on him, the lines of strain deepening on his face, his body thinner, his eyes reflecting a growing weariness. In 1965, Che Guevara, having resigned from his Cuban government posts, secretly led a contingent of Cuban fighters to the Congo Leopoldville, later Zaire, DRC, to support the Simba Rebellion, an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to foment revolution in Africa. He and his small band of about 120 Cuban internationalists fight alongside the Simbas for roughly 7 months. They engage in several skirmishes, but the rebellion fails to gain any significant momentum. The Congolese army, supported by white mercenaries, often South African and Rhodesian, who are far more effective and brutal than Batista's demoralized troops had been, gradually pushes the rebels back. Internal divisions within the Simba movement deepen, leading to betrayals and a collapse of morale. Che's Congo diary, kept meticulously during this period, is a raw, unflinching account of his disillusionment. You can almost feel the damp paper under your fingertips, the faint light of a kerosene lamp as he writes, pouring out his frustrations with the indiscipline of the rebels, the incompetence of their leaders, the futility of their efforts. He writes of the prevailing spirit of parasitism, of fighters unwilling to carry their own supplies or dig trenches. He criticizes his own failings, his inability to inspire or effectively lead in this alien context. The dream of creating an African Vietnam, of igniting a continental revolution, crumbles before his eyes. By late 1965, the situation is untenable. The rebellion is collapsing. Che and his Cuban comrades are isolated, their position increasingly perilous. The painful decision is made to withdraw. You experience the bitterness of this defeat, the quiet shame of retreat. The withdrawal itself is a difficult, clandestine operation, smuggling the Cubans out of the Congo and across Lake Tanganyika into Tanzania. So, the Congo adventure was less igniting the flames of African revolution and more a rather damp squib in a very large jungle. Even the best laid revolutionary plans can go awry. What follows is a period of limbo, of enforced hiding. Che spends several months recuperating and reflecting, first in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, then secretly in Prague, Czechoslovakia. He is a man adrift, a failed revolutionary, wrestling with the lessons of the Congo. The nights in these temporary refuges, far from any battlefield, must have been filled with introspection, with a reevaluation of his theories and his own capabilities. The vibrant, hopeful revolutionary of 1959 has been tempered by the harsh realities of wielding power and now by the bitter taste of profound defeat in the field. Historians continue to analyze the reasons for the Congo mission's failure. Was it Che's misjudgment of the local socio-political conditions and the true revolutionary potential within the Simba movement? The inherent weaknesses and tribal factionalism of the rebellion itself? The effectiveness of the government's counterinsurgency efforts, including the use of foreign mercenaries, or an unavoidable confluence of all these elements? It remains a stark example of the immense difficulties in exporting revolution, a testament to the unique complexities of each local context. Yet, even in failure, Che's spirit is not entirely extinguished. The experience in the Congo, however disastrous, seems only to have solidified his belief that his destiny lies in armed struggle. The quiet nights of forced inactivity in Prague are not an end, but a pause, a time to regroup and plan for the next, and what would ultimately be his final, revolutionary endeavor. The fire still burns, albeit perhaps with a more somber, more determined flame. The bitter lessons of the Congo expedition, the months spent in the shadows of Prague and then back in Cuba for clandestine training, have not extinguished Che Guevara's revolutionary fire. They have, perhaps, refined its focus. You feel his restless spirit, unable to settle into the quiet life of a retired hero or a bureaucrat. The dream of igniting a continental conflagration in Latin America, of creating those 2, 3, many Vietnams, still burns fiercely within him. His gaze, after much study and careful, secret planning, falls upon Bolivia, strategically located in the heart of South America, bordering 5 other nations, with a history of political instability and a militant tin mining population he hopes to mobilize. Bolivia seems, at least on paper, like a promising new front. In late 1966, you accompany him on this final, desperate gamble. He travels incognito under the alias of Adolfo Mena Gonzalez, a mild-mannered, middle-aged Uruguayan businessman working for the Organization of American States. His disguise as a balding, middle-aged Uruguayan businessman, complete with spectacles and a conservative suit, was perhaps a masterpiece of hope over verisimilitude. You imagine him trying to look convincingly bourgeois, while probably still having a copy of Mao in his briefcase. He enters Bolivia, his true identity known only to a handful, and makes his way to the remote, rugged Ñancahuazú region in the country's southeast. Here, in a dense, thorny, and unforgiving landscape of dry forests and steep ravines, he establishes a base camp. The air is thin, the sun harsh, and the nights surprisingly cold. It's a starkly different environment from the humid jungles of Cuba's Sierra Maestra or the Congo. His guerrilla force, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional de Bolivia (ELN), National Liberation Army of Bolivia, is small and eclectic. It comprises a core of trusted Cuban veterans who fought with him before, alongside a number of Bolivian recruits and a few idealistic individuals from other countries, including the enigmatic Tanya Bunke, an Argentine-born East German communist who acts as an agent in La Paz before joining the guerrillas in the field. From the outset, you sense the fragility of this group, the cultural and ideological chasms that sometimes open between the seasoned Cubans and the often ill-prepared or ideologically wavering Bolivians. The early months are a grueling period of setting up camp, reconnaissance, and attempting to make contact with the local peasant population. This, you quickly realize, is where the campaign faces its first critical failure. The campesinos of the Ñancahuazú region are mostly Quechua and Aymara, speaking indigenous people, deeply suspicious of outsiders, including Spanish-speaking Bolivians from the cities, let alone a group of armed foreigners. They are tied to their small plots of land, culturally conservative, and largely unmoved by the abstract revolutionary ideology Che and his comrades try to impart, trying to recruit stern-faced Bolivian peasants who mostly spoke Quechua and were deeply suspicious of outsiders by offering them, well, more hardship and probable death, was a tough sell. Even for Che, the lessons from the Congo about the difficulty of operating in an alien cultural environment seem to echo ominously in these barren Bolivian hills. A further devastating blow comes with the failure to secure meaningful support from the Bolivian Communist Party. Led by Mario Monge, Che had counted on the party to provide logistical support, recruits, and urban contacts. However, when Monge visits the guerrilla camp in December 1966, their meeting is fraught with disagreement. Monge insists on leading the movement himself, a condition Che, who envisions a broader, continental struggle not confined by national party lines, cannot accept. Monge departs, and with him goes the prospect of crucial urban backing. The Bolivian Communist Party's enthusiasm for Che's jungle adventure was, shall we say, minimalist. It was like inviting someone to your surprise party and they reply, "Hard pass, but do send leftovers if you survive." The guerrillas are left dangerously isolated. The environment itself is an unyielding adversary. The thorny scrubland tears at clothing and skin. Water is scarce. Food supplies dwindle rapidly. Insects are a constant torment. Illness, including Che's ever-present asthma, which worsens significantly in the harsh conditions and with the lack of medication, plagues the small band. The nights in the Bolivian wilderness are cold. The silence broken only by the chirping of insects or the distant cry of an animal. A silence that magnifies their isolation and the ever-present threat of discovery. Che Guevara began his ill-fated guerrilla campaign in Bolivia in November 1966, establishing a base in the Huazu region, but his small force failed to gain significant local support or incite a wider uprising. The Bolivian government, initially slow to react, soon becomes aware of the guerrilla presence. President René Barrientos, with significant assistance from the United States, launches a determined counterinsurgency operation. U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, arrive to train Bolivian Ranger battalions specifically for anti-guerrilla warfare. The CIA is heavily involved, providing intelligence and operational support. The noose begins to tighten around Che's small, beleaguered force. There are a few early skirmishes where the guerrillas, drawing on their experience, manage to inflict casualties on the poorly trained Bolivian army units. These minor victories provide fleeting moments of hope, but also alert the enemy to their strength and tactics. Increasingly, however, the ELN is on the defensive, hunted, and forced into constant movement. Losses mount, not just in combat, but also through desertions and accidents. The dream of sparking a peasant uprising, of creating a new Sierra Maestra in the Andes, begins to unravel with horrifying speed. Che's final diary, the Bolivian diary, is a poignant, often heartbreaking, chronicle of this desperate campaign. You can almost see him by the faint light of a flickering candle or a shaded flashlight, meticulously recording the daily struggles, the relentless marches, the hunger, the thirst, his own declining health, his profound frustration with the lack of peasant support, the indiscipline or weakness of some of his Bolivian recruits, and the growing sense of impending doom. Yet, alongside the despair, his entries also reveal his indomitable will, his moments of wry humor, his unwavering commitment to his ideals, even as the shadows close in. The failure to connect with the local population is a recurring, painful theme. Far from offering support, the peasants often inform on the guerrillas to the army, sometimes out of fear, sometimes for reward, sometimes simply because they see these armed strangers as a disruptive, alien presence. Che's idealism, his deeply held belief in the revolutionary potential of the oppressed peasantry, clashes with this stark, unyielding reality. Significant academic discussion persists over whether Che's choice of Bolivia was fundamentally flawed from the start due to its unique political and social conditions, including a peasantry that had already benefited from some land reforms under a previous government, or if the mission could have conceivably succeeded with better local alliances, particularly from the established Communist Party, and more secure logistical support. It's a question that haunts his legacy. Was he a martyr to a noble but impossible cause, or a brilliant guerrilla who made a fatal strategic miscalculation? As 1967 wears on, the situation becomes increasingly desperate. The guerrilla column is depleted, exhausted, and surrounded. In August, one of his columns, led by Juan Vitalio Joaquin Acuña Núñez, is ambushed and wiped out while trying to cross a river, a devastating blow that also means the loss of vital contacts, including Tanya Bunka. Che's own group is reduced to a handful of starving, exhausted men, constantly on the run, their footprints in the dust leading the Bolivian Rangers ever closer. The final stand is approaching, under the cold, indifferent stars of the Bolivian night. The rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Bolivian highlands, which had been your constant companion for months, now feels like a closing trap. The ELN, Che's National Liberation Army of Bolivia, is a ghost of its former self, a handful of starving, exhausted men, their numbers decimated by skirmishes, disease, and desertion. You feel the oppressive weight of their isolation, the chilling certainty of the hunt. The Bolivian Rangers, trained by U.S. Special Forces, are relentless, their patrols methodically sweeping the desolate landscape, drawing the net ever tighter around Che and his few remaining comrades. The cold nights offer little respite, only a gnawing hunger and the ever-present fear of discovery under a vast, indifferent Bolivian sky. On October 8, 1967, the inevitable happens in a narrow, rocky ravine known as the Quebrada del Uro. Che's small band is ambushed. The firefight is desperate, a chaotic exchange of bullets echoing through the desolate canyon. You are there, feeling the dust kicked up by the bullets, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the sheer terror of being hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Che, weak from asthma, malnutrition, and an earlier wound, fights on, but his M1 carbine is hit and rendered useless. Even for a legendary guerrilla, fighting a U.S. trained Ranger battalion with what amounted to a fancy club was perhaps stretching the definition of asymmetric warfare a bit thin. He is wounded again, this time in the leg. Capture is imminent. As Bolivian soldiers close in, Che, unable to fight further, reportedly shouts, "Do not shoot, I am Che Guevara, and I am worth more to you alive than dead." The words, whether uttered exactly as reported or not, hang in the air, a stark acknowledgement of his global notoriety, even in this moment of utter defeat. The fighting ceases. The legendary revolutionary, the man who had defied empires and inspired millions, is now a captive. You see him, dirt-stained, his clothes ragged, his body gaunt, but his eyes, they say, still carrying that familiar spark of defiance. He is bound and taken to the nearby village of La Higuera, a tiny, impoverished hamlet of a few adobe huts. There, he is imprisoned in a dilapidated, one-room schoolhouse. The dirt floor is cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and despair. You find yourself in this humble, almost surreal setting, watching the world-famous guerrilla leader, now a prisoner of a local army unit. Soldiers, curious and perhaps awestruck, come to stare at him. His wounds are tended to, but only minimally. The night in La Higuera is heavy with unspoken tension. The distant barking of a dog, the hushed voices of the guards, the soft glow of a kerosene lamp in the schoolhouse. These are the sounds and sights of Che's final night on Earth. Bolivian officers, and later, Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban-American CIA operative who had been advising the Bolivian forces, attempt to interrogate him. Che, though physically broken, remains largely uncooperative. He speaks with some of the Bolivian soldiers, discusses the poverty of the region, but reveals little of strategic value. He is weary, his famous asthma now a constant, rasping struggle for breath, yet he maintains a quiet dignity, a refusal to be cowed. He knows his fate is likely sealed. The decision comes swiftly, from the highest levels of the Bolivian government. President René Barrientos, in consultation with his military commanders and undoubtedly with the knowledge, if not explicit direction, of U.S. authorities, orders Che's execution. A public trial is out of the question, a trial for Che. The Bolivian government probably figured that would be less a sober legal proceeding and more a global revolutionary Woodstock, with Che on lead guitar. Best to skip that particular festival. They fear it would become a platform for his revolutionary ideals, a media circus that could further elevate his mythic status. They want to extinguish the man and the legend in one swift, decisive act. Che Guevara was captured by the Bolivian army on October 8, 1967, and executed the following day, October 9, 1967, in a schoolhouse in the village of La Higuera, on the orders of the Bolivian president. The task of carrying out the execution falls to Mario Terán, a sergeant in the Bolivian army who reportedly volunteers, or is chosen by lot, for the grim duty. The morning of October 9th dawns. You feel the unbearable weight of those final hours. Che is aware that he is about to die. Accounts of his last words vary, but they all convey a sense of courage and defiance. To his executioner, he is said to have uttered something to the effect of, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." He reportedly refuses to be blindfolded, wanting to look his killer in the eye. Inside that dusty, sun-baked schoolhouse, the final act unfolds. Tyrann, nervous, fires. Che Guevara is dead. The silence that descends in that small room feels immense, a void left by the extinguishing of such a potent life force. The immediate aftermath is a macabre attempt to manage the narrative, to prove his death to a skeptical world. His body, along with those of some of his comrades, is flown by helicopter to the nearby town of Vallegrande. There, it is laid out on a concrete slab in the laundry room of the Nuestra Señora de Malta hospital, washed and put on public display. Photographs are taken, stark, haunting images of the dead revolutionary, his eyes open, his expression serene, almost Christ-like in some depictions. In death, as in life, he seemed destined for the front page. The attempts to demystify him, ironically, only added another layer to the myth, fueling the very martyrdom they had hoped to avoid. His hands are amputated to provide fingerprint identification and sent to Argentina and later Cuba as definitive proof. His body is then buried in a secret, unmarked grave, a futile attempt to prevent his final resting place from becoming a shrine. The precise extent of CIA involvement in the direct decision to execute Guevara, as opposed to their role in his capture and interrogation, remains a topic of ongoing historical investigation and interpretation. While CIA operative Felix Rodriguez was present and played a role in the events leading up to the execution, the final order came from the Bolivian High Command. The U.S. certainly provided the intelligence and military support that led to his capture and had little interest in seeing him remain alive. But the exact chain of command regarding the execution itself is still debated by historians. Sifting through declassified documents and eyewitness testimonies, the dim light of the schoolhouse in La Higuera, the place of his end, seems to give way to a different kind of dawn, the dawn of his martyrdom. The man is gone, but the symbol, already potent, is about to be amplified exponentially by the very act designed to silence him. The Bolivian dust has claimed his body, but his story, his image, is now irrevocably loosed upon the world. The dusty schoolhouse in La Higuera falls silent, the echoes of the final shots fading into the thin Bolivian air. The man, Ernesto Che Guevara, is gone. Yet, as you stand in the quiet of this historical moment, you sense that his death is not an ending, but a strange, powerful beginning. The attempt by the Bolivian government and its allies to extinguish his influence by killing him and burying him in secrecy has an effect they likely never anticipated. It unleashes his image, untethered from the complexities of the living man, to become one of the most potent and ubiquitous symbols of the 20th and 21st centuries. The martyrdom, whose dawn you witnessed, now breaks fully upon the world. At the heart of this astonishing transformation is a photograph. You've seen it countless times. It's known as guerrillero heroico, the heroic guerrilla, taken by Cuban photographer Alberto Corda on March 5, 1960, during a memorial service in Havana. It captures Che in a moment of intense, brooding contemplation. He is looking upwards and outwards, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his expression a mixture of anger, sorrow, and fierce determination. He wears his famous black beret adorned with a single star. His hair is characteristically unruly, his beard full. It's a strikingly handsome image, imbued with a raw, romantic power. That Corda photo basically became the Mona Lisa of revolutionary chic. It had better lighting, though, and definitely more "I'm about to overthrow your government" vibes. Interestingly, Corda's photograph was not widely known during Che's lifetime. It was only after his death in Bolivia in 1967, when Italian publisher Giangiacomo Feltrinelli acquired the rights and began distributing posters, that the image exploded into global consciousness. The timing was perfect. The late 1960s were a period of intense social and political upheaval, student protests, anti-war movements, struggles for civil rights, and national liberation. Che's image, the face of a martyred revolutionary, became an instant emblem for these disparate causes. You see it blooming on posters in student dorms from Paris to Berkeley, on banners waved at anti-Vietnam War rallies, on the walls of shanty towns in Latin America, on the t-shirts of young people yearning for change. What did this image come to represent? For many, it symbolized pure, unadulterated rebellion, a defiant no to the established order, to injustice, to imperialism, to any form of oppression. It stood for the courage to fight for one's beliefs, the willingness to sacrifice everything, even life itself, for a cause greater than oneself. He became the ultimate icon of counterculture, a figure embodying resistance against the perceived hypocrisies and brutalities of the powerful, the specific details of his Marxist-Leninist ideology, his role in the Cuban government, the controversies surrounding La Cabana. These often faded into the background. What remained was the potent symbol of the eternal romantic revolutionary, the underdog challenging the Goliath, the photograph Guerrillero Heroico, taken by Alberto Corda on March 5, 1960, depicting Che Guevara at a memorial service, became one of the most reproduced and iconic images in history after Che's death in 1967. Its power lies in its ambiguity as much as its directness. That intense, upward gaze can be interpreted in so many ways. Is it a look towards a utopian future, a defiant glare at an unseen enemy, or the sorrowful contemplation of sacrifice? This adaptability allowed the image to be co-opted by an astonishing variety of movements and individuals. And then comes the great irony, the arch anti-capitalist. The man who dreamed of a new man, motivated by moral rather than material incentives, became a massively commercialized brand. His face, that iconic Corda image, was slapped onto every conceivable product: t-shirts, coffee mugs, posters, keychains, mouse pads, bikinis, vodka bottles, even baby clothes. You can almost hear Che, the staunch anti-capitalist, having a rather stern celestial chat with the first person who slapped his face on a designer handbag. "Comrade, this is not what I meant by seizing the means of production." The revolutionary symbol became a fashion statement, a piece of pop culture iconography often divorced from any real understanding of who Che was or what he stood for. His face has launched 1,000 protests, adorned countless student dorm rooms, and probably even sold a few questionable energy drinks. He's the ultimate adaptable icon, a revolutionary for all seasons, and sometimes all reasons. Cultural critics and historians actively debate whether the widespread commercialization of Che's image primarily serves to trivialize his revolutionary ideals and obscure the complexities of his life and actions, or, conversely, acts as a persistent, albeit often decontextualized, visual cue that keeps certain anti-establishment sentiments and questions about social justice alive in popular culture. Does a teenager wearing a Che t-shirt because it looks cool inadvertently absorb some faint echo of rebellion? Or does it simply reduce a complex historical figure to a meaningless graphic? Perhaps it's a bit of both. The image retains a certain edgy allure, a hint of defiance, even when it's sold in a mainstream department store. Beyond commercialization, the image continued to be used by genuine political movements. Nelson Mandela spoke of Che as an inspiration. Jean-Paul Sartre, whom she had admired, famously called him the most complete human being of our age, though Sartre also had his critiques: Palestinian Fedayeen, Irish Republicans, Latin American leftists. Countless groups saw in Che a kindred spirit, a symbol of their own struggles for liberation or self-determination. The visual power of the Corda photograph, often simplified into a stark two-tone stencil by Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick, made it incredibly easy to reproduce and adapt, further fueling its global spread. You might see it spray-painted on a wall in a conflict zone at night, a hastily made banner illuminated by streetlights during a protest, or a cherished, faded poster in the dimly lit room of an activist. Why does this particular image, this particular man, continue to hold such sway decades after his death, even for generations born long after the Cold War, long after the specific struggles he was involved in have transformed? Perhaps it's the universal appeal of the David versus Goliath narrative. Perhaps it's the romantic allure of total commitment to an ideal, however flawed that ideal or its execution might have been. Perhaps it's the visual power of the photograph itself, that compelling, charismatic face frozen in a moment of profound intensity. Or perhaps, in a world that often feels cynical and compromised, the image of Che offers a potent, if simplified, reminder of passion, conviction, and the willingness to fight for a different kind of world. The Che brand, as some have called it, often operates quite independently of the historical Che Guevara, the stern disciplinarian, the sometimes ruthless revolutionary, the flawed economic planner, the man who struggled with asthma his entire life. The icon is often a sanitized, romanticized version. Yet, the very persistence of this image ensures that the name Che Guevara continues to provoke questions, to spark curiosity, and to invite people to look beyond the t-shirt and explore the complex, controversial man behind the timeless face of rebellion. The night sky is full of stars, but this one, the star on his beret, seems to have found a permanent constellation in the global imagination. The image, that ubiquitous Corda photograph, has traveled far beyond the frame, hasn't it? It has seeped into the global consciousness, a silent testament to a life lived with ferocious intensity. But as you sit with this thought, under the soft glow of your screen, the quiet hum of the night around you, you begin to look beyond the mere visual, beyond the t-shirts and posters. What is it about Ernesto Che Guevara, the man, his actions, his words, that continues to resonate so deeply, to inspire such passionate allegiance in so many? long after his physical voice was silenced in that dusty Bolivian schoolhouse. The embrace of his icon status is widespread, and understanding it means delving into the core ideals he championed, ideals that, for many, transcend the controversies. For countless individuals and movements across the globe, Che remains first and foremost a powerful emblem of anti-imperialism. You recall his fiery speeches at the UN, his unwavering denunciations of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation, his fierce advocacy for the sovereignty of nations, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. He saw a world order dominated by powerful, wealthy nations dictating terms to the poorer, weaker ones, and he dedicated his life to challenging that order. This message of resistance against foreign domination and the fight for self-determination continues to strike a chord in regions with long memories of colonialism and ongoing struggles against economic or political interference. In the quiet of the night, you can almost hear the echoes of his words inspiring those who still feel the pressure of external powers, those who yearn for genuine independence. Beyond specific political ideologies, Che embodies the very spirit of rebellion and resistance. He is the eternal David against Goliath, the individual who dares to stand up to overwhelming power. This aspect of his appeal is particularly strong among the young, among those who feel marginalized, disenfranchised, or simply outraged by perceived injustice. His life story, from the motorcycle journey that opened his eyes to the continent's suffering, through the improbable victory in Cuba, to his doomed but defiant final stand in Bolivia, reads like an epic of unwavering commitment. Even his failures, paradoxically, can be a source of inspiration, a testament to the courage of fighting for one's convictions, regardless of the odds. Che seems to be the ultimate won't stay dead icon. Every time you think he's just a face on a t-shirt, he pops up again, looking intense and inspiring someone to question the status quo, or at least their choice of wall art. His advocacy for social justice is another cornerstone of his enduring appeal. He wasn't just fighting against something, he was fighting for something. A world free from the crushing poverty and inequality he had witnessed firsthand. His vision of a society where the needs of the many outweigh the privileges of the few, where land belongs to those who till it, where healthcare and education are rights, not commodities. These ideals continue to motivate activists working for land rights, indigenous rights, economic equality, and access to basic services. They see in Che a champion of the downtrodden, a man who not only spoke for the voiceless, but took up arms on their behalf. Then there's the undeniable power of his perceived self-sacrifice and unwavering commitment. Here was a man born into a relatively comfortable middle-class family in Argentina, a qualified doctor with the prospect of a comfortable life. Yet, he chose a path of hardship, danger, and ultimately, death, for his revolutionary beliefs. He relinquished positions of power and relative comfort in Cuba to once again throw himself into the perilous uncertainties of guerrilla warfare. You remember his farewell letter to Fidel, a moving testament to his dedication. This willingness to give everything for a cause, this perceived incorruptibility and authenticity resonates deeply even with people who may not share his specific political views. It speaks to a yearning for leaders and figures who are driven by conviction rather than personal gain. For many admirers, it's like a choose-your-own Che adventure. Focus on the daring guerrilla, the compassionate doctor, the fiery orator. and maybe just skim politely over the parts about revolutionary tribunals. Even his controversial concept of the new man, el hombre nuevo, holds a certain aspirational appeal for some, while the attempts to engineer a selfless, morally driven citizen through state power were fraught with problems. The underlying idea of striving for a higher moral purpose, of prioritizing collective well-being and working for something beyond material reward, can be inspiring. It's a bit easier to admire the ideal of the new man, selfless, tireless, morally driven, than to actually be one, especially before your morning coffee has kicked in. But the notion that human beings are capable of rising above narrow self-interest, that society can be organized around principles of solidarity and altruism, continues to fuel utopian hopes. Many post-colonial and socialist leaders in the latter half of the 20th century, such as Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, explicitly cited Che Guevara as a source of inspiration for their own revolutionary efforts and visions of social transformation. Sankara, often called Africa's Che, admired Guevara's integrity, his commitment to the poor, and his anti-imperialist stance. This illustrates how Che's example, and his writings on guerrilla warfare and revolutionary theory, provided a tangible model for others seeking radical change in their own societies. His influence wasn't just symbolic. It was, for a time, quite practical for aspiring revolutionaries. Che also perfectly embodies the romantic archetype of the revolutionary hero, intelligent, articulate, a doctor and a writer, no less, handsome, brave, and ultimately tragic. He lived and died by his ideals. This narrative has a timeless allure, captivating those who dream of a more just and heroic world. The very fact that he was an outsider in Cuba, an Argentine fighting for Cuban liberation and later attempting to spark revolutions in Africa and Bolivia, adds to this mystique of the internationalist, a citizen of the world's oppressed. There is an ongoing discussion within political philosophy and activism regarding whether Che's enduring appeal stems more from the universal aspects of his call for justice, equality, and resistance against oppression, or from the specific anti-capitalist and Marxist-Leninist ideology he espoused. For many who wear his image or invoke his name, the Che they embrace is a more generalized symbol of rebellion and idealism, perhaps detached from the doctrinal specifics of his beliefs or the harsher realities of his actions. They focus on the call to action, the spirit of defiance, the dream of a better world, rather than the precise roadmap he offered or the methods he employed. As the night deepens around you, you reflect on this enduring embrace. It's clear that for millions, Che Guevara is not just a historical figure, but a living symbol, a source of courage, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the struggle for a different world is worthwhile. This is the icon in its most powerful form, an idea, an inspiration that continues to ignite passion and provoke action, long after the man himself has turned to dust. The embrace of Che Guevara as an icon, as you've felt, is powerful and widespread, fueled by his undeniable courage, his anti-imperialist fire, and his dedication to social justice. Yet, as the quiet of the night invites deeper contemplation, you sense the need to look beyond the captivating image, beyond the romantic allure, and confront the more complex and often troubling aspects of his legacy. To truly understand this flawed idealist, we must be willing to step into the shadows that trail even the brightest icons, to examine the criticisms and controversies that are as much a part of his story as the triumphs and inspirations. The revolutionary fervor that brought him to power in Cuba also led him to preside over one of the most contentious periods of his life, his command at La Cabaña fortress. You recall the grim purpose it served in early 1959, the revolutionary tribunals, the executions of Batista-era officials and perceived counter-revolutionaries. Critics of Che Guevara point to his direct role in overseeing the revolutionary tribunals at La Cabaña fortress, which resulted in hundreds of executions, as a significant human rights concern and a stark contradiction to his image as a humanitarian. While supporters argue this was a necessary, if harsh, measure to prevent mob justice and consolidate a fragile revolution against violent opposition, critics highlight the often summary nature of these trials, the lack of robust due process, and the chilling efficiency with which death sentences were carried out under his authority. For many, this period irrevocably tarnishes his image, raising profound questions about his respect for individual human rights when weighed against the perceived needs of the revolution. Beyond La Cabaña, Che's unwavering, often rigid adherence to his Marxist-Leninist ideology is another area of critical scrutiny. He possessed a fierce intellect and a deep theoretical grounding, but this sometimes manifested as dogmatism, an intolerance for dissenting views, even among fellow revolutionaries. You remember the discipline he enforced in the Sierra Maestra, essential for survival perhaps, but when translated into governance or international revolutionary strategy, this uncompromising nature could alienate potential allies and stifle creative solutions. His 5-year plans for industry sometimes felt like they needed a 50-year plan just to understand the first 5-year plan. Central planning is a tough gig, especially when your main export is revolutionary zeal. Did his certainty in his own revolutionary path sometimes blind him to the complexities of different contexts or the validity of alternative approaches? His foray into economic management as Cuba's Minister of Industries also draws significant criticism. You've touched upon the immense challenges he faced, the U.S. embargo, the lack of skilled personnel. Yet, critics argue that his idealistic insistence on moral incentives over material ones, his attempts at rapid, centrally planned industrialization with insufficient regard for practical realities or Cuba's comparative advantages, led to significant economic mismanagement, shortages of goods, inefficient factories, and a continued, if not deepened, reliance on Soviet blockade were, for some, the tangible results of his economic experiments. His dream of a diversified Cuban economy, free from the yoke of sugar, remained largely unrealized during his tenure, and some of his policies are seen as having contributed to the long-term economic difficulties faced by the island. Then there are the ill-fated attempts to export revolution, most notably in the Congo and Bolivia. While his courage in personally leading these expeditions is undeniable, the strategic wisdom and ethical implications are heavily questioned. Were these ventures born of a realistic assessment of revolutionary potential, or were they driven by a kind of revolutionary romanticism, an almost desperate need to replicate the Cuban experience in vastly different and ultimately unreceptive environments? His attempts to franchise the Cuban Revolution (TM) in Africa and South America met with, shall we say, mixed market reception? Turns out, not every country is ready for a sudden guerrilla franchise, no matter how charismatic the founder. Critics point to a failure to deeply understand the local cultures, social structures, and political dynamics, leading to the needless sacrifice of his own life and the lives of his comrades. The adventurism label, though harsh, is one that frequently surfaces in these discussions. Furthermore, the revolutionary state Che helped to build in Cuba, while lauded for its achievements in healthcare and education, was also an authoritarian one. Freedom of expression, political dissent, and artistic liberties that didn't align with the revolution's agenda were often curtailed. Che himself, in his writings and speeches, sometimes expressed views that showed little patience for what he considered bourgeois liberal freedoms. He was all for liberating people from capitalist oppression, perhaps a tad less enthusiastic about them liberating themselves from the Revolutionary Committee's weekly reading list. Freedom can be a surprisingly narrow path when you're paving it with ideology. How does one reconcile the image of Che as a liberator with his role in a system that, for many of its own citizens, restricted certain fundamental freedoms? Considerable scholarly disagreement persists regarding the extent to which Che's more ruthless actions were a product of his own ideological convictions and inherent personality traits versus pragmatic, if brutal, responses to the violent counter-revolutionary threats and immense external pressures faced by the early Cuban government and his later guerrilla campaigns. Were his actions the unfortunate but unavoidable necessities of revolutionary struggle in a hostile world? Or did they reveal a darker, more authoritarian vein in his idealism? This is a central tension in understanding the man. His unwavering belief in armed struggle as the primary, often sole, path to achieving revolutionary change is another critical point. While he argued that oppressive regimes left no other option, this conviction often led to an underestimation of, or disdain for, peaceful or political avenues of struggle. The immense human cost of violent revolution, the suffering it inevitably entails, is something that his critics argue is not sufficiently weighed in his revolutionary calculus. As the night deepens, these uncomfortable truths settle in. They don't necessarily negate the aspects of his life that inspire his courage, his stand against imperialism, his desire for social justice, but they add crucial, sobering layers to the portrait. The flawed idealist is indeed just that, an idealist whose pursuit of a utopian vision was marked by very human flaws, by actions and decisions that had profound, and sometimes devastating, consequences. Acknowledging these criticisms is not about demolishing an icon, but about seeking a more complete, more honest understanding of a historical figure whose legacy continues to provoke, challenge, and fascinate. Long after the lamplight in his ministry office or his guerrilla encampments has gone out, the critical lens through which you've just peered reveals the sharp edges, the uncomfortable shadows, the undeniable flaws of the man who became an icon. It's a necessary perspective, for to ignore the darker aspects would be to embrace a mere caricature, not the complex human being Ernesto Che Guevara was. And yet, as the echoes of these criticisms settle in the quiet of your mind, you're left with an undeniable truth. The fascination persists. Why, after all the debates, the deconstructions, the condemnations, does Che's echo still linger so powerfully in our world? Why does his story, his image, his very name continue to provoke, to challenge, and to inspire such a wide spectrum of reactions? The night is deep. A perfect time for such lingering questions. Perhaps it's precisely in his contradictions that we find the source of his enduring magnetism. He was the compassionate doctor who became a hardened guerrilla, the idealist who authorized executions, the intellectual who championed violent revolution, the anti-imperialist hero to millions and a symbol of ruthless dogmatism to others. He is not a figure easily categorized or comfortably assimilated. Trying to definitively label Che is like trying to nail a particularly revolutionary jelly to the wall. just when you think you've got him pinned. He inspires a new song or a fresh academic argument. This inherent complexity forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice, the price of conviction, and the often blurry line between liberation and oppression. In our 21st century world, so different from the Cold War era that shaped him, do his core messages still resonate? His fierce critique of imperialism, of the exploitation of poorer nations by richer ones, of systemic inequality. You might find these themes echoing in contemporary debates about globalization, corporate power, and the persistent struggles for economic justice. While his proposed solutions, a centrally planned Marxist state and armed global revolution, are widely seen as relics of a bygone era or deeply problematic in their own right, the questions he raised about power and fairness haven't entirely disappeared. New generations, often encountering him first as that iconic Corda image, may find in him a symbol of authenticity, an unwavering commitment in a world that can often feel cynical or apathetic. It's possible that for many, it's not the intricate details of the historical Che, nor the specifics of his ideology, that hold the primary appeal. Instead, it's the idea of Che, the spirit of rebellion, the courage to defy, the willingness to sacrifice for a vision of a better, more just world, however vaguely defined. He represents, perhaps, the enduring human yearning for meaning beyond the mundane, for a cause worth fighting for. His writings, his diaries, his manual on guerrilla warfare, his essays on socialist economics and philosophy offer a deeper dive for those who seek it, revealing a mind constantly wrestling with theory and practice, though these texts themselves are, of course, subjects of intense debate regarding their insight or their obsolescence. Cuba, the nation he helped revolutionize and which he later renounced his citizenship from to pursue further struggles, has carefully curated his memory. In 1997, Che Guevara's remains were exhumed from an unmarked grave in Bolivia and returned to Cuba, where they were interred with full military honors in a specially built mausoleum in Santa Clara, a city his forces captured in a pivotal moment of the revolution. There, he is revered as a national hero, a martyr to the cause, his image and words integrated into the very fabric of Cuban national identity. Cuba has made him a national saint, minus the actual sainthood and plus a lot more cigars in his iconography. This official embrace, of course, presents its own carefully constructed narrative. And so, you are left to ponder, can one admire his dedication without endorsing his methods? Can the idealist also be a pragmatist, or are they destined to be flawed? Where does the revolutionary cross the line into zealotry? These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps Che's most enduring legacy is that he forces us to ask them, of him, and by extension, of ourselves and the world we inhabit. It seems Che is destined to be perennially relevant, popping up whenever there's a debate about justice or a wall that needs a cool stencil. He's the gift that keeps on giving to political science students and t-shirt vendors alike. Beyond the grand sweep of history and ideology, there's also the human element that sometimes gets lost. The young man with a love for poetry and chess, the asthmatic who constantly pushed his physical limits, the father, the friend, the comrade. These glimpses of Ernesto behind the Che persona add another layer of complexity, reminding us that even figures who achieve mythic status are, at their core, individuals navigating the human condition, albeit on an extraordinary stage. His legacy is a bit like that old, much-debated philosophy textbook you keep on your shelf. You might not agree with every chapter, but you can't deny it makes you think, and occasionally argue with yourself late at night. The ultimate historical judgment on Che Guevara remains elusive, with ongoing scholarly debate focusing on whether his profound global impact stems more from his actions, his ideas, or the potent symbolism constructed around his life and death. He is a mirror, in many ways, reflecting back the hopes, fears, and ideals of those who contemplate him. The answers you find to the questions he poses may say as much about your own worldview as they do about his. He remains a catalyst for thought, a figure who defies simple eulogy or easy condemnation. And now, as our long journey through his tumultuous life draws to a close, let the more challenging questions begin to soften, like the edges of distant mountains at dusk. The arguments and the analyses, the triumphs and the tragedies, can gently recede for tonight. Allow the intensity of his story, the fire of his convictions, and the shadows of his actions to find a place of quiet contemplation within you. The world outside your window continues its own complex dance, its own struggles and strivings, under the same vast, star-dusted sky that watched over Ernesto's youthful dreams in Argentina, his revolutionary fervor in the Sierra Maestra, his lonely despair in the Congo, and his final, fateful moments in Bolivia. The purpose of this journey tonight was not to provide definitive answers, for perhaps there are none to be found that would satisfy everyone. It was to walk alongside a figure who shook the world, for better or for worse, and to feel the human story within the grand historical narrative. Let the echoes of his life, the debates surrounding his legacy, now become a gentle murmur, a distant rhythm that helps to ease you towards rest. The weight of history, with all its complexities, can be set aside for now. The lamplight on the pages of his story dims, the vibrant scenes fade, and all that remains is the peaceful stillness of your own space, your own quiet breath. The journey is complete. May your dreams be untroubled, and your rest deep and restorative.